Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This is the program on education policy and governance. If you just bear with us a couple of moments as everybody enters the waiting room, I'd like to remind you that this is a recorded session. We do have the chat feature and the Q&A feature open for everyone. In a moment, we'll get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And it is my pleasure this morning to introduce Professor Paul Peterson, Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Government and Director of the Program on Education Policy and Governance here at the Harvard Kennedy School. Paul?
Well, thank you, Antonio. Antonio Wentland is the Associate Director of the program, and he's played an important role in putting this conference together. We want to welcome you to the 5th session, and this session is going to be on digital learning and school choice in the post-pandemic era. I'm Paul Peterson. During the COVID pandemic, massive increases in digital education occurred across the country. And a lot of it happened at virtual schools. But whether or not remote learning, important as it has been during the pandemic, is something to be treasured and expanded, remains a hotly debated topic. Proponents have long heralded it as a disruptive innovation with the potential to provide customized learning. But during the pandemic, a lot of students did not do as well as they had been doing in school. And we don't know the causes, but some people say it's because you don't learn as well online, or at least it doesn't work as well if you have providers such as were offering the service during the pandemic. So in looking forward, we are probably going to see digital learning, virtual schools, more and more across the country. The question is this something we should be looking forward to, or is this something that we need to be worried about? So let me turn this discussion over to the panelists, and especially to our other moderator, Daniel Hamlin, a professor of education at the University of Oklahoma. He's worked on school choice issues for many years, and he has helped put together the conference program. So Daniel, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Well, let me go ahead and introduce our panelists, and then we'll get going with their presentation. So our first panelist is Professor of Learning Technologies at Georgia State University, and she is Jennifer Darling-Aduana, and she's published many studies on digital learning, including her recent work, A Look Inside Education Settings in High School, that's featured in the American Educational Research Journal. Our next panelist is Mark Berends. He's professor and director for the Center for Research on Educational Opportunity at the University of Notre Dame. And he's published numerous studies on school choice and education reform, and has written books and edited books on school choice, including a recent version of the Handbook of Research on School Choice. And then last but not least, we have Michael Horn. He is the co-founder of the Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation. Mr. Horn is also the author of many publications on digital learning, including his award-winning book, Disrupting Class, How Disruptive Innovation Will Change the Way the World Learns, and his Amazon bestseller titled Blended, Using Disruptive Innovation to Improve Schools. So before we begin, as always, we've carved out a lot of time for Q&A, and we certainly hope that the audience will pose lots of questions, but do keep them brief so that Paul and I can locate the questions and pose them to the panelists. So we're going to start off with the first research presentation. Jennifer, I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to you.
Fantastic, thank you. Does that look good? I can't see the screen. Okay,
Looks great.
good. Wonderful. Okay. Hello, and thank you for having me here today to discuss my research. I'm going to focus today on a study published in the American Educational Research Journal by my collaborators and I, which documents a case study on supplemental online course taking offered within a traditional public school setting. But first, I want to take a quick minute to acknowledge the wide breadth of virtual learning options available. So here's one of many models that outlines all the distinct pathways virtual learning can take, from its location, the level of teacher presence available, type of instruction, curriculum, and pacing. And this is important to acknowledge because virtual learning can take as many, if not more, forms as face-to-face instruction, with similar associated variability and quality. Because remember, virtual learning platforms are a tool, and it's how you use that tool that dictates learning. It's also important to note that while a part of the larger school choice movement, virtual schools and online course platforms are often less distinguishable from existing systems than your typical charter or private school. For instance, many, such as the case study I will talk about today, specialize in supplemental courses for students who remain enrolled in their home school district. Additionally, instead of attracting solely students who are previously attending local neighborhood schools, virtual schools are often sold as an alternative or support for homeschooling, as they can provide a structured environment or curriculum for students learning from home. So with that said, I want to briefly introduce the context for the study I'll be studying today. So within this district, online course taking was used primarily for credit recovery, or allowing students to retake a course that they previously failed, often required for high school credit. And this is one of the most common uses of online course taking nationally. However, it's important to note that both failure rates and online course taking rates in this district were particularly high, with around 20% of all credits accrued at the secondary level being earned through this online course system. And so while this curriculum and online course learning platform were developed by a large for-profit company, the students were assigned to complete their courses within a computer lab at the school during the school day. The lab included access to technological devices and a lab monitor, and then students had access to the course and were encouraged to make course progress outside of the school day, which some did and others didn't, and I'll talk more about that later. So in general, a lot of the prior research on online high school course taking, particularly for this group of students, is not particularly favorable. We've seen that students from marginalized groups tend to be assigned at higher rates with low rates of course completion across the board. And challenges identified in prior literature include technological issues, instructional strategies that often emphasize memorization versus critical thinking, and some limited access to instructors. So despite all of this, the district we studied and partnered with had many compelling reasons why they contracted with this online course developer. First, the courses were designed to be completed in less time than retaking in a traditional semester-long format. Other students benefited from being able to take electives like a sociology course that were not currently offered within the district. Administrators also expressed the belief that certain features would support better learning for different types of students. And then, although not part of the official district line, many teachers describe the computer labs as safe spaces where students could be removed from bullying, fighting, other safety concerns that were present in their typical classrooms. And then lastly, contracting with the online course vendor created several efficiencies, including a lower per pupil cost per class and ensuring a minimum quality despite things such as trouble staffing the district, which resulted in a large reliance on substitute teachers as part of their main workforce. So understanding all of this, our research team was interested in who takes online courses in this district, how do they interact with the online course system, and then what policies or strategies mediated its effectiveness. So to answer these questions, we compiled a really rich data set that included information on every time students logged into the online course system and what they did there, student records from the district with demographic information and prior achievement. We conducted over 150 observations of the classrooms where online course taking occurred. And then we supplemented all of this with interviews with district staff. More detailed information on the methodology employed is available in the article itself, but at a really high level, we use several analytic strategies, including k-means cluster analysis, propensity score matching, and fixed effects to ensure the robustness of our estimates. So one of the largest contributions of our studies was using that cluster analysis to identify within the data distinct user profiles of learners to better understand who was using the online course system based on their in-course behaviors. And this allowed us to better highlight variability in course outcomes, which was previously overlooked by studies that could only look at full sample averages. So one group we identified spent a lot of time in the online course system, but much of that was idle versus active time and representing likely little engagement with the resources that were provided. We labeled this group nominal exerters. These students did the bare minimum required, and very often because of this, they did not succeed in earning back course credit. The second group was similar in a lot of ways to the nominal exerters, but they had some distinct challenges in completing course content. Students within this group were more likely to be economically disadvantaged, meaning they might have had limited access to technology at home. They were more likely to be English language learners or younger students. And so due to some of these structural limitations, we named them the incompatible strugglers, indicating that how the program was currently designed did not really seem to set up these students for success. Our third group, which was the largest of our groups, consisted of students who tended to progress quickly through the course, logging fewer average sessions and less idle time than the other groups. And so we labeled these engaged users. And lastly, we identified a pretty small group of students who displayed similar characteristics to our engaged users, with the exception that the majority of the coursework was completed outside of the school day. These students were also more likely to be economically advantaged than any of the other groups, likely meaning that they had the technology access at home to complete outside of the school day. And so for this reason, we labeled this group of students the moonlighters. Okay, so how did these students fare in their online courses? So as you might guess, the engaged users and moonlighters were more likely to successfully complete the course. But despite this, we observed no association between being assigned to an online course and the number of credits earned or student GPA compared to students who were assigned to a traditional face-to-face option instead. We also observed in some instances negative associations with end of school year test scores for students enrolled in the online course instead of its face-to-face equivalent. And in subsequent work, we found that online course taking was associated with higher rates of high school graduation, which is a good thing. And for those who are only taking one or two online courses, as opposed to like their entire trajectory, we did see small increases in college enrollment. However, at the same time, we saw significantly lower four-year college enrollments versus two-year and lower quality college enrollments for online course taking. In yet another paper, we saw lower long-term labor market outcomes for the students who enrolled in the most online courses. So this isn't incredibly optimistic. So how should we sort of understand these findings? Why are we seeing this? So first, we identified several resource constraints that limited the effectiveness of the program. They included large class sizes. There was a lack of strategic staffing. And then typical of the district as a whole, we observed high rates of substitute teachers with sometimes limited capabilities to assist the students. As the identification of sort of a distinct incompatible struggler group within our K-means cluster analysis was triangulated with insights from teachers who noticed the program had limited resources and accommodations for certain types of students. And those included students with low reading levels, English language learners, and those receiving special education services. So as you might have guessed, based on the identification of the nominal exerter group, this also highlights a broader challenge with student engagement within the online course platform, which we observed across almost all classroom observations. And one potential reason for this might be that despite the academic goals of the program, many lab monitors saw their roles as primarily, or at least including, providing more holistic support to the students. So these teachers might have been okay with students sometimes not making course progress because they saw the class period as facilitating higher engagement in other classes. However, even when teachers did encourage engagement, students often didn't comply. We regularly observe students letting the lecture run in the background while they talk to friends or listen to music before proceeding to run Google searches in order to pass the end of lesson exam and move on. All right, so what should we take away from these findings? The first big point, we observed a mismatch between the students who were assigned to online course taking in this particular context and those that we would expect to be most likely to benefit. But importantly, the low rates of engagement might also be due to overall low quality instructional design and supports. In particular, the program as implemented appeared to not really meet the needs of 9th and 10th grade students, students with lower reading levels, ELL and special education students. And at minimum, the online course taking program implemented within our partner district could have been improved, and in fact was improved over time by following the following strategies. Increasing resources to support blended learning, greater involvement of special education teachers, reducing student-teacher ratios, and providing access to content assistance outside of the platform. So I started the presentation talking about how many distinct forms virtual learning can take. And so before I turn the floor back over, I want to take a minute to place the findings from this case study and other studies I've conducted into broader discussion of under what context and for whom virtual learning is most likely to lead to higher quality learning. So the first thing is that instead of trying to evaluate whether technology use in school is good or bad, I want to encourage you to think about what instructional practices and goals technology is good at supporting, and what instructional practices and goals a traditional face-to-face environment can be more effective at. So for instance, technology is really good at gamification, providing access to experts, facilitating cross-cultural exchange, and providing multimedia experiences, or really anything that you can think of that can be mass-produced or automated. So an example of something technology is really good at is making practicing math problems or typing fun by making it into a game. That same math program might also be good at identifying the type of common mistakes students make when answering problems and automatically triggering the program to provide reminders, nudges, or more of those types of problems to practice so students can improve in that area. Integrating that type of tool can free time for teachers to focus on the type of one-on-one or small group student-directed work that leads to deeper applied learning in other areas. So once we sort of understand the strengths of technology, we can better prioritize other resources like our educational professionals to really personalize learning. Consider that not every topic in school merits deep learning. Sometimes you just need to know some basic facts. So understanding that different types of learning activities have different goals associated with them can help us identify where technology-driven tools are better equipped to help and where we really need our educational professionals. This is the type of space where a competency-based model of learning can really improve educational efficiency, freeing up resources so that they can be allocated where they can be more effectively utilized. Alternatively, we also think of face-to-face instruction as being better at fostering social connection, relationship building, and also teacher-directed oversight and structure. And so that reason, some of the most successful technology-supported instructional models I've studied have used this to sort of prioritize the relationship building, application, interactivity, collaboration, and other things like that during synchronous or blended face-to-face sessions, instead of things like delivering instruction or logistics. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen to some of my findings and conclusions. I look forward to engaging with the other panelists on the topic and thinking about other ways in which virtual learning might be able to improve student learning.
All right, those are some great questions to talk about. Thank you, Jennifer. Now I'll turn things over to Mark Berends.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me share my screen here a minute. Can everybody see that okay? And hear me okay? Yeah, so thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Those of you who know me, I'm wearing a different look at the moment. Going through a little bit of a struggle with cancer. The non-Hodgkin's lymphoma I had 11 years ago is back, but I'm happy to say that the treatment's straightforward. I'm responding and I'm very hopeful. So I ask you all to kind of share in that hope with me. So what I want to do is spend a few minutes today just talking about a paper that we did that was published in Educational Researcher. This came out in about February of 2020. So if you think about the timing of this, it's right before March 2020, where everybody pivoted from in-person instruction to online learning. So it's important to understand that this is about virtual charter schools. And these are operators whose job it is to provide educational services to students and families. I want to recognize co-authors. This has been fully collaborative. Brian Fitzpatrick is at the University of Memphis. Hire him, please. He's fantastic. Joe Farrar at the University of Washington, Bothell, and Joe Waddington at the University of Kentucky. So this paper came out of a paper I did with Joe Waddington, where we were looking in Indianapolis at different types of school choice. So what we were looking at was students who were switching from traditional public schools into another type of school, whether that school is a charter school, a magnet school, a Catholic school, or some other private school. And what we generally found there is that there were no effects of students who were switching from a traditional public school into a charter school. But we know generally from the research that effects of charter schools vary. We know that there's some studies that show positive effects for students who are economically disadvantaged, students of color. A lot of the studies have been in large urban environments, and certainly some of the lottery-based studies have found some significant positive effects in those environments. We also know that students who are attending schools run by charter management organizations tend to outperform those who are not. And we also know that these independent charter schools make up the bulk of the charter school sector. And within that, we know that schools like KIPP or the No Excuses charter management organizations, there's a pretty robust set of findings across those schools that show positive effects for students that attend them. But our focus here in this paper is on virtual charter schools. So virtual charter schools allow the opportunity for families to tailor their instruction to their students. By doing so, it also increases the instructional demands on parents. And from what we know to date, a couple of studies from Ohio, or some of this study from Credo and Mackie Raymond and her group across 18 states show that there's achievement losses for students that are attending a virtual charter school. So that brought us to the following questions, and I'm not going to I don't have time to deal with all of them today, but I just highlight the questions here that you can go into the paper. So the main question is, what's the impact over time of switching from a traditional public school to a virtual charter school on student achievement in Indiana? So we're looking at English language arts and mathematics achievement. We're also interested in sort of decomposing the variance among schools and among classrooms within schools. And that's another part of our questions. And we have the opportunity to look at some of the teacher characteristics of the teachers in our sample, and wondering whether these teacher characteristics alter the association that we find between attending a virtual charter school and student achievement. So this is just a graph that shows over the time period of our study, the kind of growth of charter schools in Indiana. The bottom line shows the growth in virtual charter schools, and the top line is in all other charter schools. And generally, you can see from this, about a quarter of the students in Indiana are educated, at least in charter schools, are educated in a virtual charter school. The data that we look at are from the Indiana Department of Education, and we're very grateful for the partnership that we've had with them over a long period of time. We have student administrative records that are longitudinally linked. We're looking over a 7-year period from the 2010-11 school year through the 2016-2017 school year. And we're looking at students in grades 3 through 8. We're looking at the state test scores from the Indiana Standardized Test of Educational Progress that was in place during the time of this study. They've since changed tests. And we standardized those scores statewide for each grade and year. And as those of you have looked at state administrative data, there's sort of the standard set of student demographics from race, whether the student is male and female, economic disadvantage, special ed, English language learners, and characteristics like that. We're also able to link students to their teachers of record. And so we have teacher and classroom data. Examples of what we have, it's not rich in teacher data, but we're able to look at teacher experience, whether they have a master's degree or not, as well as things like class size. And we link all of these data to school level characteristics with NCES data. So our analytical approach, it's not like we have oversubscribed charter schools in Indiana. So we're left with looking at quasi-experimental methods, which of course twist us every which way and fro, but this is our approach to looking at this. So basically what we're looking at are students who started in a traditional public school and moved to a virtual charter school. We match on, we do an exact match on race, ethnicity, whether the student is male or female, and free and reduced price lunch status. And once we do that, we match them with a caliber on prior achievement, plus or minus 0.2 standard deviation. So basically what we're talking about is fixed effects, but sort of a matching cell fixed effects of these students that are matched exactly within this. We came up with this approach because of some of the existing literature that has within study comparisons that have kind of a randomized experiment, but then they can replicate with some of these. And kind of the important lessons from that literature is that it's important for the treatment and comparison groups to come from the same local settings. So we're matching students with the same grade level, the same year, and the same public school that they attended before some of these students switched to a virtual charter school. And we also, despite the exact matching kind of approach, including test scores, in our regressions, we control for not only baseline test scores, but we go back an additional year to control for prior test score trends before the treatment takes effect. So this is explaining this chart here. This is basically a summary of the effects. On the left, you see the effect of students who switch from a traditional public school into a virtual charter school. And on the right, we see students who are switching from a traditional public school into what we call a brick and mortar charter school. And basically, on the bottom there, you see 0 and -1. Those are sort of baseline and baseline -1 test scores. But then we see 1, 2, and 3, which is 1 is the first year that students switch from a traditional public school into a virtual charter school, and then the second year and the third year. And we see overall that in terms of math achievement, there's really no effect of students who switch from a traditional public school into a brick and mortar charter school. But on the virtual charter schools, those students who switch from a traditional public school into a virtual charter school experience significant losses in math achievement. I mean, in the first year, it's like 0.4 of a standard deviation loss in mathematics achievement, goes to about 0.5 in the second year and nearly 0.6. So if we just even take 0.5 of standard deviation loss, we're talking about students who are losing like 17 percentile points in mathematics when they switch from a traditional public into a virtual charter school. These are the results for English language arts. Again, it's sort of the same approach with the virtual charter schools and brick and mortar. And overall, we see there's really no effects of brick and mortar charter schools on student achievement, but similar to math achievement, we see significant losses in English language arts. The magnitude of these are not as large as in mathematics. It's more along the lines of about 1/3 of a standard deviation. So we can think of that as students of switching from a traditional public to a virtual charter school are losing about 11 percentile points in their English language arts, and that negative effect is sustained over time. When looking at teacher characteristics, generally we find that virtual charter schools are less qualified if you measure that by experience and whether or not they have a master's degree compared to traditional public schools, but they tend to be a bit more qualified than their peers in brick and mortar charter schools. We find that virtual charter school teachers are assigned more students than their peers. On average, virtual charter schools have about 100 students in their classrooms compared with traditional public schools that have about 24 students. And we see that there's less test score variation in virtual charter schools that can be attributed to teachers compared to teachers in traditional public schools or charter schools. And just generally, when we run some random effects models with this, trying to control for teacher characteristics, while some of these characteristics explain some of the negative effect both in mathematics and in English language arts remains significant and negative, substantially negative. In thinking about this, we have yet to see a study of virtual charter schools that has anything but negative effects on student achievement. And as Paul was saying to kind of start out the session, I mean, this, online instruction and virtual charter schools are all the rage right now in terms of providing parents and families options to attend. But, our findings and findings of other studies to date say that while families can have a lot of reasons to have their students in a online environment, they may want to think really pretty carefully about some of these negative effects on both English and mathematics. And so one of the questions that we have is just, can high quality instruction occur in virtual classrooms? And Jennifer kind of pointed the way towards some of the characteristics that may point us down that path. And if that's possible, what types of professional development can improve online instruction in those kinds of environments? And just thinking about, a lot of schools are moving towards more blended environments, and there's a mix of studies on that, but just seeing, I'd like to see more experiments on blended learning across subjects and grade levels and even ability levels. So, ability grouping, looms large in middle and high schools in particular, but you can think about the blended learning opportunities, providing more opportunities for students in the low group as well as students in the high group to kind of address some of the inequalities that we've observed among ability group levels for decades. That's where we see as future research. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all today, and there's our contact information. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Michael Horn.
Terrific. I appreciate the opportunity to comment on both of these papers. I think they both make some important contributions to the literature, and then they have both, I think, some important policy and design implications as we go forward. So I'll address each in turn and some of the implications, and then sort of wrap up with some thoughts. And then there's some really good questions coming into the chat and Q&A. So excited to get into those. I'll start where we left off with Mark's paper first. I think it's an important paper. It, as he mentioned, in many ways reifies a lot of the research that we've seen so far in virtual schools. But I think importantly, it shows that the fall for an individual student in academic achievement lasts not just in that first year, but also extends into years 2 and 3. And that's important, I think, because a lot of the full-time virtual school operators have conceded, in many cases, the drop in academic performance in the first year, but have claimed that the longer students are enrolled, the better the academic performance is. This suggests that might not be the case. The second one, I think the matching technique is an improvement over past studies in terms of keeping the geographic areas that Mark spoke about. And then third, I also think the contribution about that teacher variability is not a big contributor is important, because it suggests that there's way more impact based on the design of the models themselves, the level of personalization, the quality of the curriculum, the external supports, the family supports, motivation, that are worth digging into still. Although I'd also add, I think the teacher model of synchronous and asynchronous learning may be worth digging further into as well, and trying to find full-time virtual schools that do more synchronous instruction as a regular part of their day. The only challenges or things that I think are areas of further investigation in the papers that I'd highlight from Mark's is, one, in its matching technique, like the other studies on this, it still doesn't account for the motivation or circumstance under which someone would choose to enroll in a virtual charter school. And I think in many cases, we see a lot of families enrolling for a medical issue or to escape bullying, for example. And we often see, and the providers often say, those students, those families are not interested in an academic outcome. They're trying to sort of get by, and academics are secondary at best. The second thing I just note is that the class size assumptions, I think, are worth digging into a little bit more. And Mark, you may have more insight on this, but in 5th grade, I think the comparison of 24 students per class in a traditional school versus 101, I think, was the data, is a valid comparison. But as you get into middle school, where a class for an individual teacher might be 24-1, but they have a class load of 5 classes, so effectively they're more like 125, I think is something to unpack a little bit more as the study, it was 5th grade was the youngest student it was looking at, and getting up into 8th grade, as I recall. And then the third one is it doesn't look at the variability potentially and I don't think you could have for this particular study, but of dollar expenditures for the schools. And I wonder if we should think about that at all to try to incentivize that deeper teacher-student interactions, or even the use of pods to create those blended learning opportunities that Mark referenced to get better outcomes. More generally, I think it points to something that we need to see in a policy basis, which is who gets to enroll in a virtual school, if you will. And the first one is, I would argue that there needs to be an engaged parent or guardian or pod-like structure as part of that for students as a prerequisite. And then second, I think we need to have some sort of baseline of minimum academic progress for a student to be able to stay enrolled over time that we should take more seriously as a policy prescription at a certain level. So those are two macro thoughts, and it'll wind its way into a bigger thought around outcomes as I switch into Jennifer's paper. From my perspective, again, the nuance, Jennifer, that you provided, I think was outstanding once again, and to be able to show the categories of different people taking the courses online based on their activity in the courses is a substantial contribution to start to see the different behaviors. The only things I would note is, again, because these are credit recovery courses, most of these students failed, right, their first course. And so they went into this. And I think what we're seeing is design issues in these courses as the district has implemented it. They don't, for example, the curriculum that they've chosen, if you read the paper that Jennifer and her co-authors wrote, they don't pass the best practices around being universally accessible to students with different learning needs. They don't have supports for students who have English as a second language. There are big red flags on who is using them and the district policy that come out from this in my mind. And a lot of the recommendations Jennifer offered, I think, are spot on. More broadly, I think it points to the fact that people, in these districts are rationally following their incentives. They're focusing on boosting graduation rates, making sure students have a high school diploma in hand. But because few states tie external objective assessments to required high school courses on the way to graduation, and this isn't just online, this is course taking, period, there's accordingly little attention paid to the underlying quality of the online credit recovery courses. And I would argue we might not be getting what we want, but we're certainly getting what we deserve based on the policy. And it's all focused around efficiency, as Jennifer said. And what's clear is something an educator told me years ago, which is that when a student has failed a course and is in danger of not graduating, she literally said, what they need most is not the learning, but the diploma. And so I think all of the behaviors accord to that from those incentives. And in my mind, most of the solutions so far that people have put out from a bigger policy perspective have skirted the fundamental issues and doubled down on mandating the inputs in terms of student-teacher ratios or seat time and things like that, without focusing on some control around the outcomes themselves. And that's where I think we really need the focus from a policy perspective. I'll just end with one reflection, since Paul mentioned that those of us who talk about disruptive innovations often talk about digital courseware as fitting into that paradigm. And I would say yes, and disruptive innovation generally starts as worse than the traditional systems, but they are better than the counterfactual for any given student, which is nothing at all. Now, the challenge, I think, is that we're not seeing the curve of growth, of improvement of these experiences because the implementations are not incentivized to come up that curve around the importance of academic outcomes. And we need to do a much better job of creating those incentives up front, so those providers, both the virtual charters in Mark's example and the districts and Jennifer's, are selecting digital curriculum, implementing blended pod-like structures that provide the right level of supports, that are using the technology appropriately, and creating the right set of interactions to significantly improve the outcomes. And I don't think we see that to this point.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I sent Daniel a little note saying that I'd like to ask the first question, but your comments, Michael, are so interesting and provocative that I think we should let Mark and Jennifer respond to them first before I intervene here. So Mark, do you want to respond first?
Jennifer, go ahead.
There's a lot there, and I absolutely agree. I think you did a really great job of sort of outlining some of the challenges of actually online course taking and virtual learning disrupting the traditional educational system. I think that the counterfactual element that you brought up is really important. We did a subsequent study that looked at what is the alternative of the online learning environment. We sampled the same schools, the same courses that students might have been enrolled in a traditional face-to-face environment. And although we saw courses that were much higher quality, we saw just so much more variability. We saw some classes where no instruction occurred because there was a student disruption and they had to call in someone from the hallway to handle it. And some students never sort of re-engaged with coursework. And there is a minimum bar in that students are getting access anytime they need it to this instructional content that is occurring in the online environment. And it's not anyone's idea of best practices, but it is something, and it's consistent. And I certainly wouldn't advocate for keeping it solely for that reason, but I think that is important to just sort of think about the alternative instructional environment that students might be exposed to. The other thing is that there is a lot of potential for technology to provide a higher quality learning environment than we were seeing with this particular online course provider, but they have their own incentive structures, which is focused around efficiency, finding things that can be standardized, that can be increased sort of profitability by scaling up a lot. And so I think that oftentimes they might not be feeling the same sort of pressure that like a virtual charter might even feel from parents, because people aren't as aware that they're the ones designing and delivering the instructional core of schooling. It's still seen ultimately as the district's responsibility, but in this case, especially initially, the district didn't feel like they had the infrastructure or the knowledge to really evaluate whether or not this was a good program. And so that's something we're doing ongoing work with the district, like how do you evaluate and ask for what you need? Because ultimately the district is still held responsible in this case, but it's sort of the like layers of accountability of this like supplemental online course provider model is interesting in that context and a little more convoluted than a traditional virtual school, if you will.
Mark.
Yeah, so Michael, thank you so much for your comments. Really appreciate that. And I think some of the things to look into are spot on. I think the issue of motivation, despite our best efforts to control for all of that in our selection, modeling, certainly we can't do that. And we do raise that in the discussion section in terms of things like what you mentioned, things like bullying. And I just know anecdotally from colleagues that they have their children in online environments for reasons way beyond achievement, and they're doing all kinds of other things to supplement what we would call learning in really effective ways, right? And so that's just something that we're not able to measure with this, given our strategy as well as the outcomes we're looking at. So that's a really good point. Yeah, and I like your point about sort of elementary versus middle school. We're kind of lumping those together in these analysis in terms of class size, and that point's well taken. And yeah, we'd love to look at expenditures. We'd love to unpack what's going on in these 4 charter schools, virtual charter schools, to understand what their strategies are, but that's all on lockdown, that we don't have access to that information. And then finally, you mentioned, some of these other kind of macro factors, and one of the factors I think you mentioned was sort of parent involvement and the importance of that. And I just think back to the study that Credo and Mackey did a few years ago that kind of gathered additional information about virtual charter schools. And one of the big factors that explains some of the negative effects, if I recall that right, is sort of time and seats, right? And so, I just know from students that at Notre Dame that pivoted to online learning. I mean, there's just so much that any of us can handle on Zoom and online instruction. And so thinking of students that are all day, every day in a virtual schooling setting, there's sort of a limit to that. And so, parents are critically involved in kind of supporting that. But if they don't have their butts in seats, they're not technically in school, right? So you can imagine that their achievement would plummet in that as well. So thanks for your comments.
Well, listen, Mark, I understand you've just covered it, but I want to press a little bit further on Michael's comment about the equivalency of your test and control students. It's an almost impossible task that I've been asked to undertake here, because the more exact you get in matching the student who goes to virtual school and the student who doesn't, the more you are going to focus on the one thing that differentiates them. The one chose to go to the virtual school for some reason, even though otherwise they would have just gone back to a regular school. So what is it that sort of encouraged them to make this choice? And there's so many different ways, so many different reasons. And so many of those reasons could suggest that this person has got a lot of problems, whether they're health problems or emotional problems, or want to do something entirely different with their life. So is this really a tractable question? We can't randomly assign people to one kind of schooling or another. So I know you're aware of this problem, but how would you solve it in the next time around, or encourage somebody else to solve
Well,
it?
I don't know if it's solvable in sort of state administrative data, quite frankly. I mean, we do the best we can, and you can I mean, we have gone around and around in terms of these matching techniques, and the fact that we're able to use a technique that, at least in some of the within study comparisons, has been able to replicate the experimental estimates with the quasi-experimental estimates. I mean, that's about as best as we can do. And we can have selection arguments till we're blue in the face about all the different motivations that parents have to send their kids to pick your school type. At the moment, we're going to pick virtual charter schools. But by and large, I think, these estimates are about as good as they can get given current technology and methodological expertise that we have out there. That being said, it'd be great to do, even a descriptive study of families that, why, we do this all the time with parent surveys of why parents choose, right? And we really haven't done that in terms of why parents choose virtual charter school environments, how long they have their students in those environments, and what their experiences are of the students and the families in those kinds of environments. And I think descriptively, that would be incredibly helpful, because we just don't know at this point. So while that's not going to get us at causality, it would allow us to have descriptive information that could shed light on some of these questions that you raise and that many of us have.
Very good.
Thank you. Maybe we'll take a few questions from the chat as well, because we're getting close to the end of the hour. So I guess one comment would be pretty hard to have an oversubscribed virtual charter school. So we may struggle on that front, it sounds like. But there was a question in the chat about advanced learners. And I'm wondering, from either Jennifer or Mark, are you able to break out advanced learners and see if the outcomes are, if you're seeing any evidence of differential outcomes? I mean, it seems to be that there's almost like two types of students. One group that's really struggling, and then one group that's maybe gifted or advanced that seems to be opting into this. And it seems like the advanced learners in online platforms are not looked at as frequently. What's the evidence like?
So I can answer that sort of two ways. The first is, within our data set, although most students were taking it for credit recovery, we did have some that were taking supplemental advanced courses. And in general, these students did very well in that they earned course credit and they progressed through. And a lot of the positive benefits we saw of students taking only one or two courses are sort of being skewed by that student population. And so it does makes sense logically that they have sort of the self-regulation skills. We observed specific students taking advanced courses in the online classrooms and talked with teachers that sort of supported both. And it does seem like that's a sort of one-off instructional model that works better when students have a track record of academic success and they know how to monitor themselves a little bit more. from the broader literature, I think that some of the places where supplemental online courses have been most successful are with that group providing access to a course they might not otherwise have. 8th graders accessing Algebra 1 in a rural location that they might not have otherwise been able to take the course, sort of things like that. And that obviously there's important things about the instructional model, but that those students might be better equipped, both because of age and because of their prior track record, to succeed if the instructional environment could give them the level of rigor that you would want.
So let me just pose a question that to Jennifer. What did you think of Michael's comment about all the school is really interested in is getting that graduation rate up? That's what the state is looking for. That's what, you know, all the political people out there are looking for. And if a superintendent can have that graduation rate up, they can sort of be sure that they'll get the contract for the next 3 years. So given that, are they really committed to making this credit recovery work other than just to get them a credit?
So you spun the question different from how I was expecting it to go. We had those questions too. Is maybe just getting that high school diploma, is that enough? And maybe that in and of itself should be the goal. And if so, it's sort of this classic, is it the signal of the diploma, or is there actual learning occurring at the high school level that you need, that the diploma is signifying, is representing, that leads to better post-secondary and labor market outcomes? And so we have subsequent papers that actually look at this. And it looks like overall, especially for students who take the most online courses, we do see that they start to drop down in labor market outcomes. And so there is something maybe that they're not learning in these courses. And so my argument would be, yes, the district should care that we're seeing, you know, a reduction in test scores that's associated with, for some students, worse labor market and post-secondary outcomes. I don't know, this is relatively recent, and so I'm not sure if access to that information has changed how the district views it. But there is certainly a lot of evidence showing that having a high school diploma is important in and of itself. So there is definitely a fine line there. You don't want to hold students back from that diploma if that in and of itself can be beneficial. I think it's challenging beyond the accountability pressures and trying to figure out what's best for that individual student. And the answer student by student is different. So how do you as a district figure that out? That's an instance where I'm glad I'm not a district administrator.
You know, when I think about full-time online learning and how it's expanded in some cases during early elementary school, I immediately wonder about issues with screen time and all of the concerns there. And I wonder, maybe Michael or Mark, if you could kind of comment on, if you're a full-time virtual student and you're in first grade, I mean, is this appropriate given what we know about screen time and some of these other issues?
Yeah, I'm happy to get into it. What's interesting about those designs, and Mark referenced one of the tensions, by the way, which is that a lot of these virtual models are intricately built around mapping to seat time requirements of the state and showing minutes logged in their learning management system to be able to justify. But the majority of full-time virtual schools at the kindergarten, first, second, third grade levels send actually huge shipments, boxes of manipulatives home with the students for them to do things offline. So similar activities with, you know, the 10 blocks and the 100 blocks and things like that to get concepts of numeracy and fluency with those and things of that nature are big parts, including science lab kits and stuff like that. So a lot of offline manipulatives are a big part of the learning model in these examples for precisely that reason. Particularly with younger students, significant amounts of screen time can become extremely problematic. I think Mark's other comment suggests that the continued mapping to seat time requirements as students get older, though, also has perils because of the Zoom fatigue, right? Simply of staring at a screen. And, you know, to Jennifer's point, mixing the modality with the type of learning experience you're trying to encourage, the exact competency or standard you're trying to develop, is something that's incredibly important. And I think a lot of full-time virtual providers have built their systems too far around the seat time requirements as opposed to the competency-based modality that they are theoretically anyway better suited for.
So I have a question about the current political situation. The mayor of New York has said that you must go to school and there will be no digital learning, there'll be no online learning, because he doesn't want parents to keep their kids at home because he wants them in school in person. And in Miami, they're saying, yes, 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 go to school, go in person, that's the better way to go. But you can learn online if you like. If you're very concerned about your child's health, you can use the online alternative. So given what we know, what's the right political decision here? So I'd like to hear you all respond, but I'll let Michael respond first, since he's probably thought about this kind of thing.
I'll try to go quick so we can get everyone in. I mean, I think restricting the choice in my mind makes no sense in the front end. And that's why I said, I think the criteria around, do you have a parent, guardian, or pod who can support? And we need to see minimum academic progress on an ongoing basis, being the two things that I would want to implement, particularly at a district level. New Jersey's governor, as noted in the chat, banned it for all students, but I think at a district level, putting in those policies to make sure.
That froze.
Oh, are we okay? Yeah, I think we're okay. So, putting in those policies that keep it efficacious, I think, are important. It's very hard to screen on the front end what those factors might be for all the reasons we've discussed. But if you have those two in place, I think you'll manage it. And I would note, New York City continues to lose massive numbers of students from its enrollment, and I suspect that students who are families who are just opting out completely into a homeschooling or unreported sort of experience because they can't find an option that meets their needs.
Jennifer.
I think that last point is worth discussing a little bit more, because saying that everyone in the public school system can't learn virtually could harm the public school system more than it helps it, because there are alternatives. You can always opt out. And virtual schools have spent a lot of time sort of running parallel and providing support to the homeschooling population, and especially with this past year of crisis era virtual learning, where it was basically just homeschooling. Parents now have an understanding of what that might look like and whether that's something they want to take on. And so I'm sure that there is like a level of marketing and trying to just convince people it's safe to go back, but it doesn't necessarily seem like something that you can legislate, because there's already alternatives built into the system. And beyond like state-run virtual charter schools, which many states do have, there's also all of these national chains that you can opt into regardless of your state level location. And so it's sort of a null question, if you will. There's tons of alternative routes, even if it's not through the traditional public school system.
I'll be quick because I know we're short on time, but I'll just say, with vaccinations the way they are, get your kids vaccinated and get them in school. I think that's the best learning opportunities that kids can have. That being said, I think both Jennifer and Michael answered the questions well in terms of what can be done in online environments, particularly for younger kids. But that puts a lot of pressure on families, right? And so, we know that's going to fall predominantly on women. And so there's other kinds of implications that we got to think about that in terms of pushing online learning as opposed to in-person instruction.
You're on mute, Daniel. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you to all three of you. We're here now at the end of the hour, so thank you for making those comments quick so that we could finish on time. So thank you again to Jennifer, Mark, and Michael for a great session. So much to talk about with online learning and virtual education, school choice. I do want to quickly note to the audience that we'll be meeting again next week, same time, same place. And we'll be addressing the question, is political support for school choice gaining or losing ground? Maybe we can touch on some of these issues related to virtual education. At that time, we'll have Maureen Downey of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Beth Hawkins of the 74, and former state representative from Georgia, Alicia Thomas Morgan, will be our panelist for that session. So thank you again, and we'll see you next week.
All right, thanks all. Appreciate the opportunity. Have a good day.
Yeah, thank you. Be well, Mark.
Thank
Thanks,
you all.
Jennifer.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you
Daniel,
next.
Paul, Antonio. Yeah, thank you all. Appreciate it.